the cloud. Okay, excellent. So we're taking a look at learning objective 2. Why were so many of the leaders of the women's suffrage movement also involved in the abolitionist movement? Why did the women's suffrage movement split? What were the results, right? So that's what you're responding to as we watch this video. So let's watch the rest, part 2 of this. There we go.
And I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, we can wait no...
The Seneca Falls Convention set off a wave of women's rights meetings throughout the 1850s. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was torn between raising her children and raising a revolution. Unable to travel, she made her voice heard in articles, letters, and at local meetings. It was following one of these assemblies that she met a restless schoolteacher from Rochester, New York, Susan B. Anthony. They began a lifelong friendship. Stanton said when she first saw that stately young Quaker woman, she knew that together they would shake the very foundations of American society. Inspired by Stanton, Anthony dedicated her life to the cause, taking to the road to fight for women's rights.
My dear Mrs. Stanton, I do not want to give up my life of freedom to become a man's housekeeper. If a girl marries poverty, she becomes a drudge. If she marries wealth, she becomes a doll. And I want none of either. Yours, Susan B. Anthony.
Oh, Susan, Susan, I shall die of a human rights convulsion. How rebellious it makes me feel when I see my husband going about where and how he pleases. Come here, and I will do what I can to help you with your speech. If you will hold the baby and make the puddings. Ever yours, Elizabeth.
So what that correspondence was depicting is kind of this role that they had. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was married. She had children, right? She wasn't this typical suffragist, or how suffragists were depicted. A lot of them were depicted like Susan B. Anthony. And this is the term iron-jawed angels. If you ever see pictures of Susan B. Anthony, she has this very stoic kind of anti-feminine look to her, right? She refused to get married, right? She equated marriage to slavery, right? And advocated that women should not marry until women had political rights, right? And so Susan B. Anthony, because she chose not to get married, had just that kind of freedom in herself. She didn't have to tend to children. She didn't have to tend to her husband's needs. So she had that freedom to travel. Elizabeth Cady Stanton did not, as a role as a wife and mother. She did travel every once in a while, but not to the extent that Susan B. Anthony would. But what Elizabeth Cady Stanton did have was a profound superior intellect and she was self-educated, but educated nonetheless. Her father had a pretty robust library that she read. She was kind of a precocious child, kind of a little prodigy child. And one thing that broke Elizabeth Cady Stanton's heart when she came to realize her role as, this gendered woman in society at an early age, she would hang out in her father's library, asking him questions about history and politics, current political issues. And one day in one of these conversations that her father really relished, he liked that his daughter wanted these conversations. But one day he looked at her and said, "Oh, Elizabeth, it breaks my heart that you are not a son," right? And in turn, that broke Elizabeth's heart because she realized what that meant, right? She realized that no matter what her interests were, no matter how much she educated herself and studied, that she was going to be greatly limited within her gender role as a woman within the confines of the society. But she had that background. And so, yeah, she would write speeches for Susan B. Anthony, and Susan B. Anthony would deliver these speeches. And this is slowly how the movement is going to gain momentum at this time.
For years, Anthony trekked from town to town to deliver her message. She never knew if people would listen politely or pelt her with rotten tomatoes. Quietly, firmly, she called for equality for all people.
There is no true freedom for woman without possession of all her rights. Whether black, white, male or female, even the smallest human right denied is large.
Anthony always carried a tremendous sense of personal dignity with her, because she always had a sense of having the rights that she actually did not have. Her message was not complicated, and that is that women must have full rights of citizenship and full equality, most basically be fully treated as human beings.
The suffrage movement would be a magnet for a handful of extraordinarily independent women. A Boston abolitionist, Lucy Stone, joined the crusade. Stone had defied convention by keeping her own name when she married. Now a paid anti-slavery speaker, she split her time working for women's rights.
The woman who departs from society's rules must suffer. But I shall brave ridicule and persecution for the sake of the good that will result.
All right, I need to interrupt this program to give you this important background tidbit here. There were the Abolitionist movement was integral to the women's suffrage movement, or the women's rights movement, when it initiated, mainly due to this event in 1840, the World Anti-Slavery Convention, when Lucretia Mott, this.
Real quick, what I'm doing here is I've interrupted, interrupted the documentary here to help provide you with a response to the first part of the learning objective. Why were so many leaders of the women's suffrage movement also involved in the abolitionist movement? And I'll also go on to explain why did women's suffrage movement split. So let's continue here. And again, for those that have joined in here, do let me know if you have any questions. You can get me in the chat tool here, or just open up your mic and I'll push pause and address your questions or provide any clarification that you need.
Person right here, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton right here met. They were very much involved in the abolitionist movement, trying to get rid of slavery.
Real quick, sorry to keep interrupting. Take note of the date here, 1840. This is 8 years before the Seneca Falls Convention, when the women's suffrage movement was launched.
Their husbands were very much involved in it, and the abolitionist movement was an international movement and gained great excitement when this convention was formed. The problem for these two individuals here, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, traveling across the pond, the Atlantic Ocean, very excited to be involved in this and envisioning the days when the scourge of slavery was finally wrested and over. When they arrived at the convention, they were told to wait out in the foyer, not to come in, because the menfolk would handle the situation. This was a profound realization to them. Not that they realized that they had been denied respect and rights and all that sort of stuff. They didn't learn here that they were an oppressed class, but it gained a new appreciation because they were with the most progressive men of their time, the most liberal men of their time, men devoted to ending slavery, which was a very radical thing to do during this time. And so they were with these men, and despite their liberal progressive leanings, they were still oppressive to women. And they realized at that moment that if they were ever to end slavery, that they had to figure out a way and devise strategy to procure rights for women, right? To manifest inalienable rights for all people, including women. So this was really the birth of the women's suffrage movement. And from 1840 to 1848, Stanton and Mott devised strategy, and that strategy was initiated with the Seneca Falls Convention. All right, back to the regularly broadcast program. Enjoy.
For 10 years, leaders of the women's movement and abolitionists all worked together. In 1861, when the issue of slavery erupted into civil war, these reformers saw the promise of independence, not only for Black Americans but for American women as well. The women would put aside their own demands and work for the Union cause. With the war behind them, Elizabeth Cady Stanton would raise the issue of the vote once again.
This is our opportunity to retrieve the errors of the past and mold a new democracy. If our rulers have the justice to give the black man suffrage, should not woman walk in by his side?
The chair recognizes the esteemed Senator.
Since the founding of the country, only the states had power to declare who could vote. Now the federal government would move to pass a constitutional amendment to enfranchise black men. Stanton and Anthony argued passionately for women to be included. But in 1869, the politicians wanted no part of the stormy issue of woman's suffrage. It was, they said, the Negro's hour.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony said, we will not put anyone's rights above our own. We have been told that we should wait, but there is no time to wait. Everyone needs their freedom and their rights now.
I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ask for the ballot for the Negro and not for the woman.
Anthony and Stanton publicly denounced the constitutional amendment that would give black men the vote, but exclude women, holding their ground when Lucy Stone condemned them as fanatics, even racists. Defiantly, they founded their own organization, the National Woman Suffrage Association. Lucy Stone remained loyal to the former slaves, and with her abolitionist allies set up a rival association to continue the fight for the woman's vote. For the next 20 years, two competing groups would carry on the campaign.
Okay, take note of what it says there, the split of the movement. The American Women's Suffrage Association, which is the movement Lucy Stone would found, and the National Women's Suffrage Association, the movement that Elizabeth Cady Stanton Stone, is going to be split, right? And this in part explains why it's going to take 72 years for this movement to achieve victory with the 19th Amendment in 1920. And it's also going to create this racist dynamic that to this day you'll hear claims and rightful claims about white female feminists, right, that represent the roles and the sentiments and the perspective of white middle class women at the expense and discounting the lived experience of women of color or women who live in impoverished roles, right? Begins at this point, this part right here. Now this, and it really did kind of bring in this racist view. There's this terrible quote from Elizabeth Cady Stanton to the effect of, it's not Sambo's turn to the right to vote. And what a Sambo was a depiction of these happy-go-lucky kind of slave, childlike kind of slave who was happy to be enslaved, right? But what's important to know here, just to have some empathy for people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, despite this kind of racial overtone, though, is they're falling victim of a classic tactic of anybody in power of divide and conquer, right? And so what you're seeing here is, again, keep in mind, the movement begins in 1848, right? And 20 years later, or about 15 years later, the country erupts in civil war in 1861. And at that time, during the Civil War, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, people like Lucy Stone, people like Susan B. Anthony said, okay, we're at war. Now is the time to push pause on this movement and focus on expediting the end of this war so we can go back to things being normal. And so, and more importantly, more lives won't be lost because everyone is focused on trying to end this war and for a Union victory, the North to win this war. And so once the war was over, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is going to reignite this movement again, obviously. What's important, though, to keep in mind is between 1848 and 1868, when we begin seeing the amendments of Reconstruction, beginning with the 14th Amendment, which was the amendment that guaranteed civil rights for natural-born citizens, and the 15th Amendment that guaranteed the right to vote for natural-born citizens. We'll clarify that in just a little bit here. What had happened between 1848 and 1868 with the passage of the 14th Amendment again is that, at first, as we pointed out in the first video, nobody took this movement seriously except for those involved in the movement. It was looked at as crazy, right? Insane. Who are these insane, crazy women doing this? And that would be still the pervasive view 20 years later, but there were enough people beginning to take this movement seriously that, were not suffragists, right? And there were men in power that were beginning to kind of scratch their head going, I can't argue with the logic, right? If these people are subjected to the laws, right? If these people have to pay taxes, if we truly are a nation, as the Declaration of Independence says that, all men, meaning humanity, are created equal, endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, how can we really justify denying these rights, these inalienable rights, to 50% of the population, right? And so people in Congress, senators and representatives, those that were opposed to women's suffrage, those that were kind of locked into this mindset that women essentially were biologically inferior, and therefore part of that essential quality of women should justify the denial of political rights. Saw this as an opportunity to really kind of put an end to this movement, or at least really sucker punch it. And so the 14th Amendment, as wonderful and as powerful as that amendment is, as was explained in this video, the first time and only time the word male appears in the Constitution is in the 14th Amendment. So all natural-born citizens cannot be denied by the states their political rights, right? It's based essentially what the 14th Amendment states. And it goes on to define, well, what is a natural inhabitant? A natural inhabitant is a male inhabitant, right? And so the 14th Amendment is ratified. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are reading this and they're horrified. And so they realized that to further strengthen the 14th Amendment's intention, they also need another amendment to specifically say that natural inhabitants of this country, male inhabitants, should have the right to vote. So from 1868 to 1870, 1870 is when the 15th Amendment is going to be passed. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and other suffragists alike are going to lobby Congress, pressure Congress to make sure that the word in the 15th Amendment would include, in addition to no citizen based on race, form, or servitude would be denied the right to vote. It would also include, back then, the word sex, right? Today we would use the word gender, but sex would not deny somebody the right to vote, right? That failed, right? And so once they realized that was going to happen, they were organizing and writing and publications saying, do not support the 15th Amendment, right? If anybody is going to get the right to vote, it should be women before Black men get the right to vote. And this is where you get this racist sentiment kind of infused in this movement. Now, given the fact that most of the abolitionists, the suffragists, I'm sorry, were abolitionists, right? People like Lucy Stone are going to look at Elizabeth Cady Stanton going, hey, I get it. I'm just as angry as you are, but this is a step forward nonetheless. And we need to be in solidarity with Black men in the South who are going to get the right to vote. And we need to support this, right? They didn't see eye to eye. And again, this is where you see two organizations split. You've got the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucy and Susan B. Anthony. And then you have the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone. And this is going to be two movements are split. The leadership isn't talking to each other. And this would remain the fact until we get to 1890, right? And then what we'll see in 1890, what is that, 22 years later, that these two organizations would come together under a big organization called NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, in which Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1890 would be the president of that. And she would remain the president of that until her death, right? Let's call it a day here with this, and I'll pick up on Learning Objective 3 tomorrow. In the meantime, you can continue working on this lecture as well as the Progressive Era lecture in World War I. But again, yeah, I just wanted to provide some clarification since there aren't notes accompanying this, and we'll take this up again tomorrow. But for those that are here, I see that, let's see, Eduardo, Raul, and Tanya, you guys are still here. Let me know if you have any questions right now or need clarification on any of these two videos before we call it a day here. Okay, no questions. Let me know. I'll hold out until I'm sure there aren't any questions. Okay. All right, if there aren't any questions, I am going to call it a day. Unless somebody interrupts me right now, I'm going to stop recording and get this posted for everybody. So later on, other people can benefit, and it'll be there for your guys' benefit if you want to review this when you're preparing your responses.